Denise and Ed Bozarth had a life most people would envy.
Living on a boat, hanging out, wearing flip-flops.
They really didn't work.
And they didn't have to.
He used to walk around with like a Ziploc baggie full of nothing but hundreds.
But then a mysterious death.
It was obvious that the body had been there for some time.
Would leave the authorities wondering.
His past might have come back to haunt him.
There were a lot of rumors that he flew drugs back and forth from South America.
That he was an informant for the Drug Enforcement Agency.
Or was it possible Denise had some secrets of her own?
Ed did ask me if Denise was cheating on him.
Oh, it's always cheaper than divorce.
Key Largo, Florida, July 1st, 2007. It was a lazy Sunday evening on the largest of the Florida Keys.
Key Largo is great snorkeling, great fishing, blue water. It's paradise. It's absolutely beautiful.
And the lifestyle is relaxed and very laid back.
It's a very small town, really kind of sleepy place.
And few places in Key Largo were sleepier than Gilbert's Marina.
Gilbert's is a quintessential Keys kind of a place. It's a marina. There's a bar there. There's a kind of a rundown hotel there.
The people Gilbert's drew were a mix of tourists, weekenders, and what the locals call liveaboards.
There are a significant number of individuals in the Keys that live on their boats.
A group of people that congregate mostly around the tiki bars.
There's a heavy drinking culture in Key Largo.
Although on that particular Sunday night, at least one resident of Gilbert's was hard at work instead.
A volunteer firefighter with the Key Largo Fire Department owned a vessel that was dry docked at the marina he was working on and fixing up.
But while he worked, he couldn't help notice the smell coming from the 36-foot cabin cruiser in the next berth.
Something that was very, very strong and very pungent.
The firefighter hailed the boat.
The boat was called the Screw You 2.
And when no one answered, the firefighter clambered aboard to investigate.
He went over to the boat, lifted the hatch.
And when he did, the sickly sweet odor was overpowering.
The Keys are very hot in the summertime. They maintain a consistent temperature around the 90s.
One whiff was all it took. The firefighter slammed the hatch shut, pulled out his cell phone, and dialed 911 to report a dead body.
As a firefighter, he knew what death smelled like.
The body was still aboard the boat, and it was obvious that the body had been there for some time.
Although before sheriff's deputies even arrived on the scene, the caller had a pretty good idea just who the dead body might be. Because the boat belonged to an eccentric liveaboard named Ed Bozarth and his wife, Denise. Born in 1973, Denise grew up in the Florida Panhandle on the opposite end of the state from the Keys.
Denise's parents lived in Defuniak Springs, Florida. It's a mostly rural area just to the west of Tallahassee.
Her father was a Florida state trooper, and he raised his daughter to be respectful, hardworking, and quiet.
She was very reserved when it came to talking about herself.
Not that there was much to tell. Denise married young, but the marriage ended in divorce, and by her mid-20s, she was living on her own in South Florida, eking out a living with a series of low-paying, part-time jobs.
She was a waitress. She was out at the shrimp docks, just doing what she could to get by.
And she wasn't afraid of hard work or manual labor.
She was a fairly stocky and strong woman.
And it was while working on the docks in the mid-90s, helping unload the day's catch, that she met Ed Bozarth. Born in 1945, Ed grew up in Miami and spent most of his adult life as a pilot, flying all over South Florida, the Caribbean, and Latin America.
My dad loved to fly. He was a spray plane pilot for a while. He flew DC-3s, which he really enjoyed.
Although when he met Denise, he'd recently given up crop dusting and flying charters to try his hand at being a shrimp boat captain.
He liked the solitude about boating. He liked the freedom to be able to go wherever you wanted to go.
And while he'd been married and divorced multiple times,
He had fathered children by, I think, 3 women.
he was most comfortable being alone.
My dad was a very complicated person. He was someone that would sit back and observe people.
However, the admitted loner was also in his mid-50s, and shrimping was hard physical labor. So after a few weeks observing the hardworking young woman hustling to unload the daily catch on the docks, he offered to hire Denise on as crew.
She would run the shrimp boat with my dad. That's pretty much where everything started. You know, she started working for him.
And it wasn't long before Ed and Denise were more than just captain and first mate, too.
They just became close.
Despite the fact that they made an unlikely-looking couple.
Ed was rail thin. He's not a real big guy.
He was like pretty much bony almost. Denise was a big, hefty woman.
And there was a big difference in their ages, too.
Mr. Bozarth was 25 years older than Denise.
However, Ed quickly fell for his much younger first mate.
He loved her. That was clear to see.
Denise must have felt the same way about Ed, too, because when he asked Denise to marry him, she said yes.
They got married June of '98.
And for all their differences, the marriage appeared to work.
Their relationship seemed absolutely, completely normal. I mean, Ed was a little bit possessive. She would get upset with him sometimes about certain things, but they seemed to get along fine.
In fact, they soon started a family.
He had 2 children with Denise.
Ed was pushing 60, though, and by 2001, he and Denise had sold the shrimp boat and bought a cabin cruiser.
It's a 36-foot Trojan, twin inboard. It was fairly tight quarters. It was laid out fairly nicely.
They had sleeping in the bottom level, 2 rooms. One was the kids and one was Ed and Denise's room. And then, of course, you had the living room, which had the kitchen and, you know, a little common area.
Denise and Ed sailed the cabin cruiser to Key Largo, leased a berth at Gilbert's, and settled in to semi-retirement.
He did some various jobs around the marina and assisted people with various work projects or mechanical issues.
And while Ed tinkered, Denise focused on raising the couple's 2 toddlers.
They really didn't work.
They didn't really need to either. Shrimping, or something, had apparently been very good to Ed Bozarth.
He used to walk around with like a Ziploc baggie full of nothing but hundreds.
And he'd unzip that bag whenever Denise needed something.
Ed gave her everything that she ever wanted. He would do anything for this woman.
Not that she ever wanted much. Living on a boat with 2 small children may have been a little crowded, but it did allow Ed and Denise to enjoy the sort of laid-back Florida Keys lifestyle other people could only experience on vacation.
They had access to the bar and the restaurant and could go out in the ocean with the boat.
They were living the dream life of the Keys, living on a boat, hanging out, wearing flip-flops.
Denise also spent a fair amount of her evenings hanging around Gilbert's Tiki Bar.
She was kind of a bar fly.
They had bands on the weekends, which were absolutely lovely to go sit and listen to. It was just a really beautiful place to go hang out, very friendly.
Ed, on the other hand, kept mostly to himself.
We would say, we're going to the tiki bar. Ed would hand her money so she could go out and have a great time with just be careful. That's all he ever said to her. He'd kiss her and say, just be careful.
And then he'd go back to tinkering around the couple's cabin cruiser.
People barely ever saw Ed off the boat.
He didn't have very many friends.
And the few he had often had a hard time getting in touch with him.
He didn't have email. He didn't have a cell phone.
While the outgoing Denise drank at the bar, Ed had increasingly become a hermit, one whose philosophy was best summed up by what he'd christened their cabin cruiser, the Screw You Too.
It's just his attitude and his approach toward, people.
He liked his privacy. He didn't want people to know his business.
Or was there more to it than that? Thanks to that bag of cash he always carried around, the gossip at Gilbert's Tiki Bar was that in addition to being eccentric, the former pilot was also in hiding.
There were a lot of rumors that he flew drugs back and forth from South America.
Not only would that explain all the cash, Ed dropped a fair number of hints himself, spinning all sorts of wild tales on those rare nights he did turn up in the Tiki Bar.
He always talked about missions that he was on, airplanes that he was in, jumping out of an airplane, just all sorts of craziness.
Although the way Ed told it, he wasn't a drug smuggler. In his version of the story, Ed was always working for the good guys.
The legend of Ed Bozarth was that he was some sort of informant or an agent for either the DEA or the CIA.
Whether Denise's husband had really been a drug dealer or a DEA informant, it was tough to know for sure.
Who knows in the Keys? I mean, a lot of people have stories.
It just seemed too fascinating to be true.
And as it turned out, Ed Bozarth had one more good story in him, even if he wouldn't live to tell it. At 11:30 on the night of July 1st, 2007, a volunteer firefighter who lived in a Key Largo, Florida marina noticed a suspicious odor coming from the boat in the next berth.
And he described the smell as being very horrific.
It was very noticeable because the smell was prevalent throughout the parking lot.
Law enforcement was called and boarded the vessel.
And when the deputies went below decks, they found the source of the odor, a man's dead body.
He was found in the starboard engine compartment.
The body itself was wrapped inside a sail bag, the type of bag you'd store a sail aboard in a sailboat.
He was very badly decomposed.
Despite that, it was obvious how the man had died.
His head had been bashed in.
It was obvious it was a homicide.
And whoever had killed him had meant to keep it a secret as long as possible.
The interior of the vessel was air conditioned. There were 2 different air conditioning units that were set to the lowest temperature on the thermostats.
It also appeared that the killer had tried to clean up the crime scene, too.
The carpet had been removed.
But when the killer pulled up the carpet, they must have realized that short of sinking the boat, there was little hope in totally destroying the evidence.
There was what appeared to be blood on the floorboards.
Had that discovery caused the killer to give up and leave the body behind? For the moment, the investigators had no idea, but they did have a clue as to who the body in the boat might be.
The registered owner was Edward Bozarth, and the information that we obtained early that morning was that he, his wife Denise, and their 2 small children lived aboard that vessel.
Everyone in the marina, they knew whose boat it was.
Confirming that the body was Ed's would take time, though. So while coroner's personnel removed it for the autopsy, the investigators fanned out across the marina to question Ed and Denise's neighbors. One of the first people they spoke to was a marina security guard named Campbell, who lived on a boat moored near Ed and Denise's cabin cruiser.
Docked probably about 50 feet or so behind the Bozarth's vessel. And after knocking on the door a few times, he finally opened the hatch.
Like all the other liveaboards at Gilbert's Marina, the guard knew Ed and Denise, but he told the investigators he didn't know anything about what had happened. In fact, he didn't seem all that curious about it either.
He didn't question the fact that there were law enforcement vehicles and crime scene tape all over the place, which was kind of odd.
Other neighbors were far more intrigued, though, and several in the group that gathered just outside the crime scene tape told the investigators they hadn't seen Ed Bozarth around for about a week. But they also said that wasn't unusual, given the retiree's antisocial tendencies.
They wondered where he was, but they had not been terribly concerned.
Neighbors also said that Denise and the couple's 2 children had been gone even longer.
The children had gone to stay with their grandparents in North Florida 2 weeks prior to this. 1 week after that, Denise had left town to go up to her parents in North Florida as well.
And according to at least some of their neighbors, Denise hadn't planned on coming back. At least that was the gossip around Gilbert's Tiki Bar.
Most people said that Denise and Ed did not have a good marriage.
However, that wasn't the only or even the juiciest thing that the investigators learned from Ed and Denise's neighbors.
There had been a rumor that he was an informant for the Drug Enforcement Agency back in the 80s.
And now that Ed had been murdered, his neighbors couldn't help but wonder, maybe it was true.
There was some speculation that his past might have come back to haunt him.
Someone coming for revenge.
Was it possible that Ed's murder was drug-related? When the investigators followed up with the DEA, they hit a dead end.
they either couldn't or wouldn't provide any information.
Not even to law enforcement, local law enforcement.
With the DEA unable to either confirm or deny the rumors, the possibility of a drug hit was starting to sound a little more plausible. But when the investigators contacted Ed's older daughter, Ariana, with the news that her dad was dead, she offered up an entirely different theory, one concerning her stepmother.
The lead investigator, I told him instantly, Denise did it.
Not that Ed's daughter actually had any proof.
It was just one of those things where you have that gut instinct.
The investigators needed more than a gut instinct, though. And by that evening, they had made the long drive to North Florida to interview Denise at her parents' house in Defuniak Springs.
She was surprisingly calm and cooperative. She didn't have that concern or that shock that someone would have, even if they were in a bad relationship, that their spouse was just found murdered.
Perhaps. Although according to Denise, Bad didn't even begin to describe her relationship with Ed.
Denise said that he was physically abusive to her.
Denise said her son, not yet 10, could back her up on that, too.
One of the two children living with them on the boat told police that he had seen Ed give his mother a black eye.
Denise told the investigators that Ed had been beating her for years.
It was an ongoing, abusive relationship.
But according to Denise, that was the first time he had actually struck her in front of the kids. And she said that had finally spurred her to take action.
On June 16th, her parents picked up her two children.
And a week later, Denise had followed.
She moved out. She packed her bags and left for Defuniak Springs.
But had she done more than just leave Ed? The investigators fished for a confession.
I gave her an out. I gave her the battered wife syndrome. I said, look, if you did it, it was probably during self-defense. Just tell us exactly what happened.
But Denise didn't take the bait.
She came across as just not really knowing much.
And unlike her neighbors at the marina, she wasn't willing to speculate either.
Denise did not have anything to say as far as what might have happened.
Could Ed tell them something about his killer, though? On July 3rd, the Monroe County Medical Examiner performed an autopsy on the body tentatively identified as Ed Bozarth.
The medical examiner was able to determine that the cause of death was blunt force trauma.
The weapon would be consistent with something like a hammer.
The medical examiner positively identified the body as Ed's a few days later.
He had to be sent up for a forensic analysis by the Florida Department of Law Enforcement because his body was so badly decayed.
They were no closer to identifying his killer, however.
We were being very objective, not being just focused on one person.
Although that didn't stop them from going back to the marina and re-interviewing Denise and Ed's neighbors to try and confirm what she'd told them about her husband's abuse.
We saw that there was motive.
And the marina staff, Ed and Denise's fellow liveaboards, and even the regulars at Gilbert's Tiki Bar all appeared to confirm it.
The majority of the witnesses that we spoke to described Ed as being very controlling.
One woman called him creepy.
And she had a point, considering all the things friends and neighbors said that Ed did.
Not allowing Denise to go to the bathroom for more than 10 minutes. He wouldn't allow her to use her cell phone unless he was present.
Some even confirmed her son's story, more or less.
Denise had told her friends and other people at the marina that Ed had been physically abusive to her.
He was rumored to have given her a black eye shortly before Denise left town.
However, the investigators also noticed something odd about all the rumors of abuse floating around the marina.
We don't have documentation of domestic violence between them prior to this murder.
There are no eyewitnesses that ever saw any kind of physical altercation between the two of them.
And even if there had been, few people at the marina would have pegged Ed as the winner.
Describing Denise as being the controlling part of that relationship.
Denise was significantly bigger than Ed. Ed was a small man. Denise is a big woman.
But the biggest surprise came when the investigators spoke to the marina security guard for a second time.
We had a lengthy interview with him.
And this time, Campbell admitted to being less than forthcoming with the detectives the first time they spoke.
He ultimately ended up telling the police that he had lied.
For starters, Campbell told the investigators that he had a very good reason to be concerned about Ed's murder.
He had had an affair with Denise.
By the 4th of July, 2007, it had been a little more than 48 hours since Denise Bozarth's husband, Ed, had been found dead on the couple's boat in a Key Largo marina.
It was decaying. That's why he was discovered, is because of the smell.
Some neighbors speculated that the 62-year-old retired pilot had been killed because of his supposed past as a DEA informer.
One of the rumors that kept coming back to us said that Ed was probably killed by somebody that he had, shared information on.
But that wasn't the only theory floating around the marina.
The other theory was that his wife killed him.
They were known to be fighting, and he was rumored to have beaten her shortly before Ed ended up being found dead.
And one of the Bozarth's neighbors, the marina security guard whose boat was berthed in the next slip, had just admitted to having an affair with Denise.
He admitted that he had had a sexual relationship with Denise Bozarth and had for at least a month before Mr. Bozarth's death.
But was the affair the motive for murder, or merely part of the setup? Because the fact that he'd been sleeping with Denise wasn't the only bombshell Campbell dropped during his interview.
Denise had offered him $10,000 to kill her husband.
The security guard said he'd refused Denise's offer, but the investigators couldn't help but wonder, had she gone ahead without him?
We questioned, was it possible for Denise alone to not only kill Ed, but to tie him up and stuff him into a bag in the boat? And yes, she could have done that with him. He's not a real big guy.
Why Denise might want Ed murdered was fairly clear to investigators.
They were fighting. There was apparently physical abuse.
But when the investigators spoke to Ed's adult children from his previous marriages, they discovered that Denise may have had another motive: money.
Ed's family expressed concerns that Denise would inherit several $100,000 if Ed were to die.
Ed Bozarth recently came into $600,000.
And despite Ed's habit of carrying around a plastic bag full of cash, it wasn't drug money or a payoff from the DEA.
It was an insurance policy from his dead mother.
The source of Ed's cash may have been anticlimactic, but it made for a powerful motive, especially when combined with rumors of an abusive marriage.
She was involved in a very bad relationship, and there was an incentive to get out of it and to be rewarded for getting out of it.
And then there was the fact that Denise had left Key Largo at the same time her husband disappeared.
She packed up and left June 23rd, and Ed was found on July 1st.
The last time that he had been seen was the day that she left.
Motive, timing, and the fact that she tried to pay another man to do the job. For the authorities, it all added up to one thing: Denise Bozarth had murdered her husband.
There really wasn't any other individual that was realistically responsible for this crime.
But while the authorities were convinced, could they convince a jury? For starters, Denise had no record.
How can you go from not being a violent person to committing a murder in such a violent, brutal fashion as she did, bashing her husband's head in?
They couldn't use forensics to put the murder weapon, believed to be a hammer, in Denise's hand either. In fact, the investigators never found it.
We did search the water underneath the boat, and it was not found.
What forensic evidence they did have was of little use.
Her DNA would have been on the boat because she lived there. So that wouldn't tell us really anything.
And considering the source, the one piece of evidence connecting Denise to the murder, the security guard's claim that she'd offered him $10,000 to do it, was just as problematic.
He was definitely a suspicious character, particularly considering that he was close to Denise.
Not only did he admit to having an affair with Denise, he'd already lied to them once, initially claiming to know nothing about the murder. And that left the investigators uncertain whether to believe Campbell when he said he'd refused Denise's offer of $10,000 to kill Ed.
We actually have never been able to rule him out.
All in all, it added up to a very shaky case, and the prosecutors would only get one shot at a conviction.
In a homicide, you don't get a second chance, and if they're exonerated, that's it, they're done.
So for the moment, they waited.
They just did not have the evidence they needed to go arrest Denise.
And in 2010, after 3 years passed with no new evidence,
They declared the case inactive.
by 2011, the murder of Ed Bozarth was just another of the many stories told over margaritas at Gilbert's Tiki Bar.
It's a very small town, so when a homicide happens, there's a lot of talk.
Stories were about all that was left, too. After the murder, Denise had sold Ed's boat, moved back to northern Florida, and started her life over again.
She was living with a boyfriend.
But just when it appeared that Ed's murder was destined to be nothing more than another piece of local folklore, there was a new sheriff in town, literally. And after winning the election, he decided to review a few of the unsolved cases his predecessor left behind.
The Bozarth case being one of them. So he assigned a new detective to basically start the investigation over again from the beginning.
They put new eyes on it.
One of the first things the new investigator assigned to the case did was make the long drive to the Florida Panhandle to question Denise again.
He went and re-interviewed her several times.
And when he asked her when was the last time she saw Ed, Denise gave a different answer. Previously, when talking to the detectives, Denise claimed she'd last seen Ed asleep in their cabin on the boat. But this time,
she says that he had got on a bus and was going to go to Key Largo, and that's the last time she saw him.
Of course, it had been 4 years since the murder. Maybe she'd forgotten. But the investigators did talk to someone who had a much better memory of the events leading up to Ed's death, a friend of Denise and Ed's named Bonnie Colon. Bonnie had been living in Inverness, Florida, when she met Denise and Ed in 2005.
I was working at a restaurant and they came in all the time. Ed's mom passed away and they were staying at Ed's mom's house until all the stuff was sold.
Bonnie had quickly taken a liking to the couple, especially the eccentric Ed and his wild stories.
Ed would tell me about missions he was on in South America, and he would always just have something amazing to say.
The waitress remained friends with the couple after they returned to Key Largo, too. In fact, she'd gone down to visit them several times, including one lengthy visit in June of 2007, just before Ed's murder.
She had been present on the boat for several weeks prior to Ed Bozarth's death.
My divorce was going through and they invited me to stay with them.
And when the police tracked her down and spoke with her at the end of 2011, Bonnie told the investigators that she hadn't been living with the Bozarths long before she realized their marriage was in trouble, too.
Ed did ask me if Denise was cheating on him.
And according to Bonnie, the answer wasn't just yes. She made the affair sound far more serious than the security guard had ever let on.
They were talking about taking off and going somewhere in the Caribbean.
However, Bonnie said that running off with her boyfriend wasn't all that Denise had talked about that June.
When she started talking about killing Ed.
She was frustrated with him. She wanted a way out.
At the time, Bonnie said that's all she thought Denise was doing, venting her frustration.
A lot of people say that they want to kill their boyfriends or their girlfriends. So I just always thought that she was just, messing around or just saying stuff.
Although according to Bonnie, the stuff Denise said had included possible ways of killing her husband.
She was talking about how she could just knock him over his head and throw him into the water. I always thought it was just a joke.
But the investigators weren't laughing, especially when they heard another one of the scenarios Denise had supposedly come up with.
She had told Bonnie that one of the ways that she wanted to kill her husband was to hit him in the head with a hammer while he was sleeping, cover him in plastic, and put him in an engine compartment.
Turns out that just happened to be the way that my dad was actually murdered.
Joking or not, Bonnie said that Denise talked about killing Ed so often that she had eventually found somewhere else to stay.
She got tired of Denise talking about wanting to kill Ed, so she left.
That wasn't the end of Bonnie's story, though. She told the investigators that she'd gotten a cryptic call on June 23, 2007, a week before Ed's body had been found, warning her to stay away from their boat.
Denise called me to tell me not to go to the boat, that she was leaving Ed. She didn't want me to get involved.
Or in hindsight, was there another reason for the warning?
She didn't want me to find Ed's body.
In March of 2012, it had been almost 5 years since a neighbor found Ed Bozarth dead on the boat he shared with his wife Denise in Key Largo, Florida.
He had smelled his decomposing body. He hadn't seen Ed for a little while, so he called the Monroe County Sheriff's Office.
The authorities had long suspected that Denise had killed her husband. The question was whether or not they could prove it.
We had some circumstantial evidence, but we did not have the physical evidence that was needed.
What they did have was a statement from another of Denise's neighbors, a man who also worked as the marina's security guard, claiming that she tried to hire him to kill her husband.
She offered $10,000 to Mr. Campbell.
That's what Campbell said, but the authorities weren't sure a jury would believe him. After all, the fact that he was having an affair with Denise gave Campbell a motive to kill Ed, too.
Certainly we had suspicions about Mr. Campbell.
But then, at the end of 2011, a friend of Denise's named Bonnie Colon had come forward with information that appeared to confirm the guard's story. According to Bonnie, Denise had spent the weeks before the murder talking openly about killing Ed.
Denise had been talking about scenarios much like what ended up happening.
Bonnie stated that Denise wanted to bash Ed in the head and just wrap him up and stuff him away somewhere.
I was like, oh my God, this woman said she was going to kill him, and she did.
So on March 14, 2012, investigators from the Monroe County, Florida Sheriff's Department once again made the 600-mile drive to Defuniak Springs to talk to Denise. And this time, they brought an arrest warrant.
There was definitely sufficient evidence where we could charge Denise with the murder.
When she was apprehended, she was taken to the sheriff's office in Escambia County near Pensacola, and she was given her Miranda warnings.
Not that Denise heeded them. More than anything, the 39-year-old appeared to be in a hurry to get the interview over with.
I asked for an attorney, then we're going to be here all day.
Well, no, at that point, I'll just leave. I can't talk to you at that point.
But when given the opportunity to stop the interview then and there, Denise passed on it.
Having these rights in mind, do you wish to talk to us now? That is the question. Yes. Okay.
And at first, Denise claimed that she had nothing to hide. She told the investigators that she and Ed weren't getting along, so she had decided to take the kids and leave.
Did you think there were going to be any issues when you were leaving between him and you? It was okay with you leaving?
She really didn't say anything substantial for quite some time.
But the investigators kept pressing.
She was confronted by the police with, the inconsistencies of her story.
And that's when Denise's story changed again.
She tells the detectives very reluctantly that she was worried that her husband was going to kill her.
His motto was, bullets always cheaper than divorce.
The investigators immediately saw an opening.
Was he being abusive? I mean, I don't want to fill in all the blanks here, Denise. I'm pretty sure I understand. Can you just give me a couple of details? Was there any weapons?
Okay.
He had a weapon? What happened? You threatened you with it?
She stated that she awoke and that her husband was standing over her and pointing a gun to her head.
He was going to kill me, and they tried to get the kids. He killed them too.
Denise said she'd done what anyone would have in her situation.
Was there a fight over the gun?
And when Ed kept coming toward her, Denise said she'd grabbed a hammer lying by the bed and hit her husband with it, repeatedly.
You strike him until he stopped moving?
She hit him so hard that it cracked his skull from one end to the other and one end to the other.
Although Denise confessed to killing Ed, she insisted that she hadn't planned to do it, and that what happened had nothing to do with her affair with the marina security guard.
Did he help you in any way? I mean, I know he wasn't there for
the hammer, but did he help you clean up the incident?
And Campbell's claim that Denise had offered him money to kill Ed, or all the things she'd supposedly told Bonnie. According to Denise, they'd simply misunderstood her.
We basically told him the same thing I told Bonnie. The only way I'd get any relief or be able to get away is if he passed away.
That's what Denise claimed, at least. But the authorities had their doubts.
She was having an affair with Campbell, and Mr. Bozarth had just inherited approximately $650,000.
And for that reason, they had some serious doubts about Denise's self-defense claim.
We speculated that she may have hit him while he was asleep.
So once the interview was over, the investigators transported Denise back to Monroe County, where she was charged with first-degree murder.
We felt that if the case were to proceed to trial, that we would prevail.
But in December of 2013, with the trial fast approaching, something happened that would leave that confidence shattered. During a preliminary hearing on December 17th, Denise's attorney argued that her confession should be excluded from the upcoming trial.
During the interview with a Monroe County Sheriff's Office detective, she had apparently asked to speak with her lawyer.
It had happened right before she admitted to killing her husband.
Denise, you guys have some kind of a true story that you can lay out that makes sense to us. You know what I mean? For your defense attorneys and prosecutors, I think they'll be sympathetic towards what.
Contrary to what he told her at the start, the investigator didn't stop the interview.
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's something that you're going to have to work out with your attorney.
And a few minutes later, as the interview continued, Denise brought up the matter of an attorney again.
Will I be able to talk to an attorney today?
You can call anybody you want.
However, the investigators still didn't stop the interview, a fact the prosecutors tried to downplay.
I thought the detectives adequately answered her question. It was more of an offhand comment like, well, do you think I'm going to need a lawyer?
But the judge disagreed. In fact, he ruled everything past the point Denise first asked for a lawyer inadmissible in court.
The confession was thrown out.
On April 8, 2014, Denise Bozarth stood in a Florida courtroom. It had been almost 7 years since her husband's body had been found on their boat in Key Largo, and a little over a year since the 41-year-old had admitted to killing Ed, a confession that had been ruled inadmissible in court.
They actually had to throw out her confession because investigators did not let her speak to her lawyer.
I was upset that they ended up having to toss the confession.
And what was especially upsetting was that without Denise's confession, a conviction might be tough to come by.
It was going to be a harder case because it was all circumstantial now.
So rather than take their chances at trial, the prosecutors had offered Denise the opportunity to plead guilty to a lesser charge.
After discussing the case at length, it was decided that the case would plead out to a second-degree murder and a 14-year prison sentence.
I would have wished for her to be in there longer, but something is better than nothing.
Denise took the deal.
There was enough evidence to where her lawyers realized she had to make some kind of plea deal.
And she stood before the judge that morning and pleaded guilty to Ed's murder.
I almost think that maybe it's her way of coming to peace with the whole situation.
After 7 long years, the search for Ed Bozarth's killer was finally over. Although the outcome wasn't exactly satisfying.
What's 14 years for killing a man? I think she should have been in jail for a lot longer.
And while the second-degree plea deal was due to necessity, most remain convinced that Ed's murder was premeditated.
I don't think it was a crime of passion. I think that it was cold and calculated and thoroughly thought out.
She deserves to serve all 14 years. She deserves to stay there as long as possible.
On the morning of August 8th, 1993, the stillness of the Tuscan countryside was broken by an unsettling discovery in a wooded area near the small town of Chiani. In the province of Pisa, hidden among the trees stood a burned-out Volvo 245, its blackened frame bearing silent witness to an act of extraordinary violence. At first glance, it appeared to be yet another abandoned vehicle destroyed by fire. The kind of scene investigators occasionally encountered in isolated rural areas. But as firefighters extinguished the last traces of smoke and investigators began examining the wreckage, the true horror slowly emerged. Inside the trunk of the charge station wagon were 2 bodies. The victims were identified as Francesco Vinci, 52 years old, and Angelo Vargio. Both men had been bound before they died. Both had been shot. Their bodies had then been hidden inside the trunk before the vehicle was deliberately set ablaze, apparently in an attempt to erase every possible trace of the crime. It was a calculated execution rather than a spontaneous act of violence. And from the very beginning, investigators understood they were dealing with offenders who had planned their actions carefully. Yet the brutality of the murders was only the beginning of the story. The name Francesco Vinci immediately transformed what might otherwise have been considered another organized crime killing into a case that captured national attention. Years earlier, Vinci had become one of the most recognizable names in one of Italy's greatest criminal investigations. For a time, police believed he might have been the elusive serial killer known throughout the country as the Monster of Florence. The unidentified murderer responsible for a series of notorious double homicides that terrorized Tuscany for more than a decade. Newspapers had once placed his photograph on their front pages. Television broadcasts had discussed his criminal history, his personal relationships, and his possible connection to murders that had horrified an entire nation. For many Italians, Francesco Vinci had once symbolized the possibility that the mystery of the Monster of Florence had finally been solved. Yet the case against him eventually collapsed. While Vinci was imprisoned, the killings attributed to the Monster of Florence continued. That simple but decisive fact fundamentally changed the investigation. A man who had once appeared to be the leading suspect could no longer be responsible if new victims were still being found while he remained behind bars. Investigators were forced to acknowledge that the evidence was insufficient, and in time he was released. Years later, in 1989, the entire line of investigation focusing on a group of Sardinian suspects, including Vinci, was officially abandoned because authorities lacked evidence capable of supporting criminal charges. Legally, Francesco Vinci was no longer considered responsible for the infamous serial murders. Nevertheless, his name never escaped the shadow of suspicion that had surrounded him. Once someone becomes publicly associated with one of history's most infamous unsolved crimes, That association rarely disappears completely. Even after investigators moved on, Vinci continued to occupy a strange place in Italy's criminal history. To some, he remained a former suspect who had narrowly escaped conviction. To others, he represented an example of how circumstantial evidence and public pressure could direct an investigation toward the wrong individual. Regardless of those differing opinions, no one expected that years later his own death would become another enduring mystery. The discovery of the burned Volvo raised immediate questions that extended far beyond the identities of the victims. Who had wanted Francesco Vinci dead? Why had the killers chosen such a brutal method? Why bind both victims before shooting them? And why burn the vehicle afterward? Each element suggested planning, experience, and determination. Investigators noted that both victims had been restrained using a method known as incaparamento, in which a victim's hands and feet are tied together behind the back. This style of restraint had long been associated with executions carried out within certain Sardinian criminal circles. The presence of this distinctive method immediately influenced the direction of the investigation. It suggested that the murders were not random acts committed in anger, but carefully orchestrated. Killings intended to send a message or eliminate specific individuals. Yet while this observation appeared significant, it did not answer the central question that soon dominated newspaper headlines. Was Francesco Vinci killed because of his criminal associations? Or was there another explanation buried beneath years of unanswered questions surrounding the Monster of Florence investigation? Public fascination with that possibility emerged almost immediately. The timing alone seemed almost impossible to ignore. Here was a man who had once stood at the center of Italy's most famous serial murder investigation, now himself found murdered under circumstances that were both violent and mysterious. Some wondered whether he possessed knowledge that had never become public. Others questioned whether his death represented the final chapter of an investigation that had already consumed decades of police work and endless speculation. Journalists revisited old files. Television programs replayed archival footage. Once again, Francesco Vinci's name appeared across newspapers, but this time not as a suspect. This time he was one of the victims. The irony was impossible to overlook. For years, investigators had tried to determine whether Vinci had been capable of murdering others. Now investigators faced an entirely different challenge, determining who had murdered him. The reversal transformed the public narrative surrounding his life. Regardless of his criminal past, regardless of previous suspicions, Francesco Vinci had become the victim of an unsolved homicide. His death demanded the same careful examination that any homicide investigation required. Assumptions based on reputation could not replace evidence. Just as suspicion years earlier had ultimately proven insufficient to establish his responsibility for the Monster of Florence crimes. As detectives secured the scene near Chiani, they confronted a crime scene that offered frustratingly few answers. Fire had destroyed much of the physical evidence that might have identified the perpetrators. The isolated location reduced the likelihood of eyewitnesses. The deliberate nature of the crime suggested offenders who understood the importance of eliminating forensic traces. Every indication pointed toward careful preparation rather than impulsive violence. In many ways, the killers had achieved exactly what they intended. They left investigators with 2 dead men, a burned vehicle, and an abundance of questions. Over the months and years that followed, authorities would pursue multiple investigative theories. Some focused on Vinci's long-standing connections within Sardinian criminal circles. Others examined whether personal disputes may have escalated into lethal violence. Public speculation repeatedly returned to the Monster of Florence investigation, despite prosecutors later concluding that no legal evidence established any connection between Vinci's death and the infamous serial murders. Each possibility contained pieces that seemed plausible, yet none ultimately produced sufficient evidence to identify the killers or bring anyone before court. More than 3 decades later, the burned Volvo discovered on that August morning continues to symbolize an enduring mystery. The identities of the men who carried out the execution remain unknown. Their motives have never been conclusively established. Francesco Vinci's life had already become intertwined with one of Italy's greatest criminal enigmas, long before his death. Ironically, his murder ensured that his name would never truly disappear from discussions of unsolved crimes. It remains a story not simply about a man once accused of unimaginable violence, but about how easily the boundary between suspect and victim can blur, and how even decades of investigation sometimes fail to answer the simplest question in any homicide case. Who did it? Long before Francesco Vinci's name became associated with one of Italy's most notorious criminal investigations, he was simply a man who had left his birthplace in Sardinia and eventually settled in Tuscany, a region whose rolling hills, vineyards, and quiet villages would later become internationally known for reasons far darker than anyone could have imagined. The details of Vinci's early life remain limited within the available historical record, and much about his personal history has never been publicly documented. What is known is that he was born in Sardinia before relocating to Tuscany, where he became involved with the local criminal underworld. Over time, he accumulated a criminal record that included offenses involving violence, theft, and other criminal activities. Those convictions would later influence the way investigators viewed him when a far more serious series of crimes began to unfold. In criminal investigations, a suspect's past often shapes first impressions, and Vinci's background ensured that his name would receive close attention whenever police searched for individuals capable of committing violent acts. Yet a criminal history alone never establishes guilt for a particular crime, a distinction that would become critically important in the years ahead. By the late 1960s, Francesco Vinci's life intersected with that of a woman named Barbara Lacci. Their relationship would later become one of the most frequently discussed aspects of Vinci's biography, not because of the relationship itself, but because of the tragic events that followed. Barbara Lacci would become one of the first victims in what investigators later recognized as the opening chapter of one of Europe's most infamous serial murder cases. At the time, however, no one could have anticipated the historical significance of the crime. In 1968, Barbara Lacci and her lover were murdered. Initially, the double homicide appeared to be an isolated act of violence. Investigators had no reason to suspect that the crime would eventually become linked to a series of killings stretching across nearly 2 decades. The murder entered police records as one more difficult investigation among many, and the passage of time gradually pushed it into the background. But years later, developments in forensic analysis dramatically changed how authorities viewed that forgotten case. As additional murders occurred throughout Tuscany between 1974 and 1985, investigators noticed disturbing similarities among the crimes. The victims were typically couples, and the murders demonstrated patterns that suggested a single offender or offenders might be responsible. The unidentified killer soon became known throughout Italy as the Monster of Florence, a name that inspired fear across the country and eventually attracted international attention. The investigation expanded into one of the largest criminal inquiries in Italian history, involving years of police work, countless interviews, and repeated attempts to identify the person responsible for terrorizing the region. One of the investigation's most significant breakthroughs came not from eyewitness testimony, but from ballistics. Experts eventually determined that the firearm used in the 1968 murder of Barbara Lacci and her Lover was the same weapon used in the later murders attributed to the monster of Florence. This discovery fundamentally transformed the earlier homicide, rather than standing apart from the later crimes. The 1968 double murder was now considered the beginning of the entire series. Overnight, a case that had once appeared isolated became the first chapter of a prolonged and deeply disturbing criminal mystery. That forensic connection also brought renewed attention to everyone associated with Barbara Lacci, including Francesco Vinci. Because Vinci had previously been involved in a relationship with Lacci, investigators naturally considered whether he might possess information relevant to the case. As detectives explored that possibility, they developed what eventually became known as the Sardinian Trail, a theory suggesting that the origins of the murders could be found within a network of individuals from Sardinia living in Tuscany. Within that investigative framework, Francesco Vinci emerged as the principal suspect. His criminal background, his relationship with Barbara Lacci, and his connections to other Sardinians all appeared, at least initially, to fit the direction investigators were pursuing. Public interest intensified as the investigation focused increasingly on Vinci. Newspapers followed every development, reporting on police activity and discussing the possibility that authorities might finally have identified the elusive monster of Florence. His name became widely recognized across Italy, and with that recognition came enormous public scrutiny. The distinction between suspicion and proof often becomes blurred during highly publicized investigations, particularly when a case has remained unsolved for years. Vinci found himself at the center of precisely that situation. Although investigators believed they had reason to examine him closely, the burden of proving criminal responsibility remained unchanged. In 1982, authorities arrested Francesco Vinci as part of the ongoing investigation. For many observers, the arrest appeared to represent a decisive breakthrough. After years of uncertainty, it seemed possible that police had finally identified the individual responsible for one of Italy's most feared crime sprees. Yet criminal investigations are governed by evidence rather than expectations, and events soon challenged the assumptions underlying the case against Vinci. While he remained in custody, murders attributed to the monster of Florence continued. Each new crime carried enormous significance because it demonstrated something investigators could not ignore. If the same offender was still killing while Vinci was imprisoned, then he could not have committed those later murders. The continuation of the killings severely undermined the theory that had placed him at the center of the investigation, rather than confirming investigators' suspicions. The crimes exposed a critical weakness in their reasoning. The reality confronting detectives was difficult but unavoidable. Their principal suspect possessed an exceptionally strong practical alibi for murders committed while he was incarcerated. As a result, Francesco Vinci was eventually released. The investigation continued, but its focus gradually shifted away from him and the broader Sardinian theory. Years of additional inquiries failed to produce evidence capable of supporting criminal charges against Vinci or the other Sardinian suspects. Finally, in 1989, authorities officially abandoned that investigative direction. The entire Sardinian group, including Francesco Vinci, was clear because prosecutors lacked sufficient evidence to proceed. Legally, the outcome was unambiguous. Suspicion had not become proof. The criminal justice system could not sustain allegations unsupported by evidence, regardless of how compelling those allegations may once have appeared. Yet legal exoneration does not always erase public memory. Even after authorities moved on, Vinci's name remained closely associated with the Monster of Florence investigation. For many members of the public, he continued to represent one of the central figures in the decades-long mystery, despite the absence of evidence establishing his guilt. It was a burden that followed him long after investigators formally shifted their attention elsewhere. At the same time, another reality continued to shape his life. Although he had been cleared in connection with the serial murders, nothing about that decision altered his documented involvement with criminal activities unrelated to the Monster of Florence case. His earlier convictions involving violence, theft, and other offenses remained part of his history. Investigators understood that distinction clearly. Being innocent of one crime does not erase responsibility for others, just as possessing a criminal record does not prove involvement in an unrelated homicide. These parallel truths defined Francesco Vinci's complicated public image. He was neither the monster many had once believed him to be, nor an entirely ordinary citizen, unfairly caught in extraordinary circumstances. Instead, he occupied a far more complex position. He was a man with genuine criminal associations who had nevertheless been unable to be linked, through evidence, to Italy's most infamous serial murders. That complexity would become even more significant after 1993. Had Vinci quietly disappeared from public attention following his release, history might have remembered him only as a former suspect in an unsolved investigation. Instead, fate placed him at the center of another mystery. The same name that had once appeared in headlines beneath the word suspect would later return, beneath the word victim. Before that transformation occurred, however, Francesco Vinci remained a figure living in the shadow of his past. Every discussion of the Monster of Florence inevitably revived memories of the Sardinian Trail and of the period when investigators believed they had solved the case. Although official conclusions had changed, the questions surrounding the investigation never fully disappeared. Those unresolved questions lingered in the background, waiting until a summer morning in 1993 when the discovery of a burned vehicle near Chiani would once again force Italy to confront the name Francesco Vinci. This time, not as the man accused of taking lives, but as the man whose own life had ended in a brutal and still unexplained execution. The morning of August 8th, 1993, began like countless other summer mornings in the hills of Tuscany. The countryside surrounding Chiani was quiet, its forests and winding rural roads largely untouched by the bustle of nearby towns. It was the kind of landscape where abandoned farmhouses, olive groves, and dense clusters of trees created long stretches of isolation. Yet somewhere within that peaceful setting stood a scene that would soon draw police investigators, forensic specialists, and journalists from across Italy. Hidden among the trees was a Volvo 245 station wagon that had been consumed by fire. By the time authorities reached the vehicle, the flames had already done their work. The exterior was blackened, the windows shattered, and much of the interior had been reduced to twisted metal and ash. At first glance, investigators could immediately recognize that this was no ordinary vehicle fire. The isolated location alone raised questions. Cars abandoned in remote woodland often suggested deliberate concealment rather than accidental. Mechanical failure, as firefighters ensured that every remaining hotspot had been extinguished. Investigators cautiously approached the wreckage. Every burned vehicle presents unique challenges. Heat destroys fingerprints, biological traces, fibers, and countless other forms of forensic evidence. If the fire had been intentionally set, then whoever started it likely understood that flames could erase many of the clues that might otherwise identify those responsible. The investigators knew from experience that time was already working against them. The longer the fire had burned, the fewer answers the vehicle would provide. Their initial inspection soon revealed that the fire concealed something far more disturbing than property destruction. As officers searched the remains of the Volvo, they opened the rear compartment and examined the trunk. Inside, they made a grim discovery. 2 bodies had been placed within the confined space before the vehicle was burned. The victims were later identified as 52-year-old Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu. Their deaths immediately transformed the burned automobile into the center of a major homicide. Investigation. Forensic examination established several critical facts about the crime. Both men had been restrained before their deaths. They had been tied using a method known as encapritamento, in which the victim's hands and feet are bound together behind the back. The restraint leaves the victim almost completely unable to resist or escape. Investigators recognized the significance of this detail almost immediately because the method had long been associated with executions carried out within certain Sardinian criminal circles. It was not simply a means of restraint, but a distinctive style of binding that investigators believed reflected planning rather than improvisation. Whoever carried out the attack had taken time to overpower both victims, secure them tightly, and eliminate any realistic possibility of resistance. The victims were then shot. After the killings, their bodies were placed inside the trunk of the Volvo. Only after the bodies had been concealed inside the vehicle was the final stage of the crime carried out. The offenders deliberately set the station wagon on fire, apparently intending to destroy physical evidence that might connect them to the murders. Every confirmed element of the crime scene pointed toward careful preparation rather than spontaneous violence. There was no indication that the killings resulted from a sudden argument that escalated without warning. Instead, investigators concluded that the offenders had first gained control of both victims, restrained them securely, executed them, concealed the bodies, and then attempted to erase the evidence through fire. Each stage required time, coordination, and purpose. The sequence itself suggested that whoever committed the murders expected to avoid immediate detection and understood the value of destroying forensic evidence. The condition of the burned Volvo reinforced that assessment. Fire had severely damaged the vehicle, complicating every aspect of the forensic investigation. Potential fingerprints, DNA evidence, fibers, and other microscopic traces that might normally survive inside an automobile were either destroyed or badly compromised. The intense heat altered surfaces throughout the vehicle, making it far more difficult for specialists to distinguish between damage caused directly by the killers and damage resulting from the fire itself. Even seemingly routine questions, where each victim had been seated before death, how long the vehicle had burned, or whether additional objects had once been inside the car, became much harder to answer because of the extensive destruction. The isolated location presented another obstacle. The wooded area near Chiani offered privacy that offenders seeking to conceal a crime could easily exploit. The absence of nearby homes or heavy traffic significantly reduced the likelihood that anyone had witnessed the murders themselves or even the arrival of the vehicle. Investigators searched for evidence that someone might have noticed unusual activity in the area, but the location naturally limited opportunities for eyewitness observations. Rural landscapes often provide criminals with time, distance, and silence. 3 advantages that investigators must overcome through physical evidence rather than testimony. In this case, much of that physical evidence had already been consumed by flames. The identity of Francesco Vinci immediately guaranteed intense public attention. Although the crime scene itself suggested an organized execution, journalists quickly recognized that one of the victims had previously occupied a central position in Italy's most famous unsolved serial murder investigation. Newspapers across the country revisited Vinci's history as the former leading suspect in the monster of Florence inquiry. For many members of the public, the discovery seemed almost impossible to separate from that earlier investigation. The image of a man once suspected of being one of Italy's most notorious killers now lying dead inside the trunk of a burned vehicle naturally generated widespread speculation. Yet the facts available at the crime scene remained remarkably limited. investigators focused not on speculation, but on the physical evidence before them. They observed that both victims had clearly been under the complete control of their attackers. Before death, the restraints demonstrated that neither man had been left with any meaningful opportunity to defend himself or escape. The placement of the bodies inside the trunk indicated that the killers had remained at the scene long enough to conceal the victims before igniting the fire. The deliberate burning of the vehicle strongly suggested an attempt to destroy evidence rather than conceal the deaths indefinitely, since a burned automobile in a remote forest would eventually attract attention. Instead, the fire appeared intended to delay identification of the victims and eliminate forensic traces capable of identifying the offenders. One of the most significant observations concerned the style of restraint itself. The use of incapacitamento did not automatically identify the perpetrators, nor did it establish a definitive motive. However, investigators regarded it as an important investigative clue because of its known association with certain Sardinian criminal practices, rather than pointing toward a random act of violence. The method suggested a killing carried out according to a recognizable pattern familiar to law enforcement. Even so, investigators understood that similarities in execution style alone could never substitute for direct evidence. The method provided a possible investigative direction, but not a conclusive answer. Every homicide investigation begins by distinguishing established facts from assumptions, and the officers examining the Volvo understood that maintaining that distinction would be essential. By the conclusion of the initial crime scene examination, investigators had established only what the available evidence could support. Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu had been restrained, shot, placed inside the trunk of a Volvo 245, and the vehicle had then been deliberately set on fire. The brutality of the crime left little doubt that the killings had been intentional and carefully organized. Beyond those facts, nearly every important question remained unanswered. Where had the victims first encountered their attackers? Had they been restrained at the location where they were found, or somewhere else before being transported? How many offenders had participated? What relationship existed between the killers and the victims? What motive justified such a calculated execution? None of those questions could yet be answered through the evidence recovered at the scene. As investigators completed their initial examination and the burned vehicle was removed for further forensic analysis, they faced the difficult reality that the fire had already accomplished much of what the offenders likely intended. Vital evidence had disappeared. The wooded location had offered privacy. No obvious witnesses had emerged. The crime scene provided certainty about how the victims had been treated, but almost none about who had carried out the murders. Nevertheless, the investigation was only beginning. Detectives would soon turn their attention away from the burned Volvo itself and toward the lives of the two victims, particularly Francesco Vinci, whose complicated history, criminal associations, and previous connection to one of Italy's greatest unsolved mysteries would shape every stage of the inquiry that followed. With the crime scene secured and the two victims formally identified as Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu, investigators entered the most demanding phase of the case. The immediate task was no longer simply documenting what had happened inside the burned Volvo 245, but determining who had carried out the killings and why. Although the condition of the crime scene clearly suggested a deliberate execution, the evidence available to detectives was frustratingly limited from the very beginning. Fire had destroyed much of the physical material that would normally form the backbone of a homicide. Investigation. Every investigator understood that a successful prosecution depends not upon suspicion or reputation, but upon evidence that can withstand careful examination. In this case, that evidence had been severely compromised before police ever arrived. The first stage of the investigation focused on the forensic examination of the vehicle itself. Specialists carefully inspected every remaining portion of the burned Volvo in the hope that the flames had spared some usable trace. They documented the damage, examined the structure of the trunk where the bodies had been discovered, and attempted to reconstruct the sequence of events leading to the fire. Investigators sought to determine whether the victims had been killed inside the vehicle or elsewhere before being placed into the trunk. The available information confirmed only that both Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu had been restrained, shot, concealed inside the vehicle, and that the Volvo had then been deliberately set on fire. Beyond those established facts, the destruction caused by the blaze prevented investigators from reaching many of the conclusions that might otherwise have been possible. Normally, a vehicle can preserve fingerprints, biological material, fibers, hair, footwear impressions, or other microscopic evidence linking offenders to a crime scene. In this investigation, however, the intense heat had erased much of that forensic record. The deliberate burning appeared to have accomplished precisely what the offenders intended. It significantly reduced the quantity of physical evidence available to police. Even the search for the murder weapon reached an immediate obstacle. Although investigators confirmed that both victims had been shot, they were unable to identify the firearm responsible for the killings. Without the weapon itself or sufficient ballistic evidence capable of linking it to a suspect, detectives lost another potentially valuable investigative path. As the forensic work continued, detectives simultaneously began examining the lives of both victims. Standard homicide procedure requires investigators to understand not only how victims died, but also how they lived, their relationships, personal histories, financial dealings. And recent activities often reveal motives hidden behind an otherwise silent crime scene. Francesco Vinci's background naturally became the primary focus. Unlike many homicide victims, Vinci was already well known to Italian law enforcement. His previous criminal convictions involving violence, theft, and other criminal activities were thoroughly documented. More significantly, his years as a prominent suspect in the Monster of Florence investigation had generated extensive investigative files containing interviews, background information, and records of numerous personal associations. Detectives reviewed those materials carefully, not because they believed the earlier accusations had been proven, but because understanding Vinci's network of relationships could potentially identify individuals with reasons to target him. Investigators also examined Vinci's more recent contacts, searching for evidence of conflicts, disputes, or criminal associations that might explain why someone would carry out such a carefully organized execution. Attention extended beyond Vinci himself to Angelo Vargiu, the second victim found inside the trunk. Because both men had died together under identical circumstances, detectives considered the possibility that one victim had been the primary target while the other had been killed because of his presence or his association with the intended victim. Alternatively, investigators recognized that both men might have been deliberately selected. Determining whether the murders were directed primarily at Vinci, at Vargiu, or at both individuals became an important part of the inquiry. Unfortunately, the available evidence provided no clear answer. With little physical evidence available, detectives increasingly relied upon interviews. Numerous individuals connected to Francesco Vinci's life were questioned in an effort to reconstruct his recent activities and identify anyone who may have wished to harm him. Investigators examined his relationships, his movements before his death, and any known disputes that might have escalated into violence. Given Vinci's documented history within criminal circles, particular attention was directed toward his connections with members of the Sardinian community and individuals involved in organized criminal activities. Detectives hoped that someone might provide information about recent disagreements, threats, or meetings capable of explaining the murders. Yet as interviews accumulated, certainty remained elusive. Various individuals could describe Vinci's reputation or discuss his past, but no witness emerged with first-hand knowledge of the killings themselves. No one reported observing the murders. No one could identify the attackers. The investigation, therefore, became increasingly dependent upon evaluating competing theories rather than following direct evidence toward a known suspect. Among the various possibilities considered by investigators, the theory regarded as most plausible centered on organized criminal retaliation within Sardinian criminal circles. Several factors contributed to this assessment. Francesco Vinci had known associations within the Sardinian criminal world, including connections involving smuggling activities and personal disputes. More importantly, the manner in which the victims had been restrained drew immediate attention. The use of incapacitamento, binding the hands and feet together behind the back, had long been associated by investigators with executions connected to Sardinian organized crime. Combined with the deliberate shooting of both victims and the subsequent burning of the vehicle, the overall pattern appeared consistent with a planned criminal execution rather than a spontaneous act of personal violence. Detectives therefore devoted substantial effort to exploring whether Vinci had become involved in conflicts serious enough to result in his death. They examined possible disputes, rivalries, and criminal relationships that could have provided a motive. However, although the theory appeared consistent with several aspects of the crime scene, consistency alone could not identify the perpetrators. No witness directly connected any individual or organization to the murders. No forensic evidence established who had restrained the victims, fired the fatal shots, or ignited the vehicle. Consequently, even the investigative theory considered strongest remained exactly that, a theory supported by circumstantial observations rather than conclusive proof. Public attention, meanwhile, increasingly focused on a different possibility. Because Francesco Vinci had once been regarded as the leading suspect in the Monster of Florence investigation, journalists and commentators questioned whether his death might somehow represent another chapter in that infamous mystery. Speculation developed that Vinci may have possessed information about the serial murders or perhaps even known the true identity of the killer. Some suggested that his execution had been intended to silence him permanently. These ideas attracted significant media interest because they connected two already notorious criminal cases into a single dramatic narrative. Yet investigators and prosecutors approached such speculation with considerably greater caution. Throughout the inquiry, authorities searched for evidence capable of establishing a factual connection between Vinci's death and the Monster of Florence investigation. Despite those efforts, no legal evidence emerged supporting that conclusion. The similarities existed primarily in public imagination rather than in demonstrable forensic or testimonial proof. Over time, prosecutors concluded that there was no evidentiary basis for linking the homicide to the serial murder investigation. Although the theory remained attractive to journalists and members of the public fascinated by unsolved mysteries, investigators could not substantiate it through evidence. A third line of inquiry involved the possibility of personal revenge. Witnesses familiar with Francesco Vinci described long-standing disagreements and tensions involving individuals from his criminal environment. Detectives therefore considered whether Vinci and Angelo Vargiu may have been lured to a meeting under false pretenses before being ambushed. Such a scenario would explain how both men came under the complete control of their attackers before being restrained. Nevertheless, once again the investigation encountered the same obstacle that had frustrated every other theory. There was insufficient evidence to identify who arranged such a meeting, where it occurred, or who ultimately carried out the killings. The possibility remained under consideration, but never advanced beyond speculation, supported by limited circumstantial information. As months passed, Investigators repeatedly returned to the physical evidence recovered from the crime scene, hoping that renewed examination might reveal details previously overlooked. Unfortunately, the fundamental limitations imposed by the burned vehicle remained unchanged. The fire had destroyed much of the forensic evidence. No eyewitnesses had come forward. The murder weapon remained unidentified. Without those critical investigative components, detectives lacked the foundation necessary to transform suspicion into prosecutable evidence. The case gradually became an illustration of one of the most difficult realities in homicide investigations. Investigators may possess reasonable theories about motive and possible perpetrators while simultaneously lacking the evidence required to prove those theories in court. Every available lead was examined within the limits of the surviving evidence, yet each ultimately reached the same impasse. Organized criminal retaliation appeared plausible. Personal revenge could not be excluded. Public speculation regarding the monster of Florence persisted despite the absence of supporting evidence. None of those possibilities produced the combination of physical evidence, witness testimony, and identifiable suspects necessary to solve the murders. The investigation, therefore, entered a prolonged period of uncertainty. Detectives had reconstructed the broad outline of the crime. 2 men had been overpowered, restrained using a distinctive method, shot concealed inside a Volvo, and the vehicle had then been deliberately burned. They had identified several possible motives and carefully evaluated each one. They had questioned individuals connected to Francesco Vinci's criminal associations and reviewed his past in remarkable detail. Yet despite years of investigative effort, the essential question remained unanswered. The identities of the individuals who planned and carried out the execution of Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu remained unknown, leaving investigators with an extensive case file filled with possibilities, but without the decisive evidence required to bring anyone before a judge. Unlike many high-profile homicide investigations, the murder of Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu never reached the stage that most criminal cases ultimately seek: a courtroom where evidence could be tested, witnesses questioned, and responsibility determined through legal proceedings. Instead, the investigation gradually confronted a reality that prosecutors face in every legal system. However compelling a theory may appear, criminal charges cannot be sustained without evidence capable of meeting the burden required by law. In the years following the discovery of the burned Volvo near Chiani, investigators continued examining every available lead, but none produced the combination of physical evidence, reliable testimony, and identifiable suspects necessary to move the case into the judicial process. As a result, there was no public trial, no defendant seated before a judge, and no verdict capable of bringing legal closure to the families of the victims or to a public that had followed the investigation with intense interest. This absence of judicial proceedings is itself one of the defining characteristics of the case. The lack of an arrest did not reflect a lack of investigative effort. Detectives had reconstructed the sequence of events as accurately as the surviving evidence allowed. They established that Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu had been restrained using the method known as incapacitamento, that both men had been shot, that their bodies had been placed inside the trunk of a Volvo 245, and that the vehicle had then been deliberately set on fire in what investigators believed was an effort to destroy evidence. Those facts were supported by the crime scene itself. What investigators could not establish, despite years of work, was the identity of the individuals responsible for carrying out those actions. Without that crucial link between the crime and specific suspects, prosecutors lacked the legal foundation required to initiate criminal proceedings. Throughout the investigation, authorities carefully evaluated each of the principal theories that emerged from the available evidence. The first and most substantial involved the possibility of an execution connected to Sardinian organized crime. Investigators considered this explanation particularly significant because of Francesco Vinci's documented criminal associations and because the method used to restrain the victims had long been associated with executions within certain Sardinian criminal circles. The combination of careful planning, restraint, execution-style killings, and the deliberate destruction of evidence through fire appeared consistent with an organized criminal retaliation. Yet consistency is not proof. Even when a theory appears to explain many aspects of a crime, prosecutors must still demonstrate who committed the offense. In this case, investigators were unable to identify specific perpetrators through forensic evidence or witness testimony. The theory, therefore, remained an investigative conclusion rather than a prosecutable case. A second theory attracted considerable public attention because of Francesco Vinci's earlier role in the investigation into the monster of Florence. For years, Vinci had been one of the most recognizable figures connected to that notorious serial murder inquiry. After his own death, journalists and commentators inevitably questioned whether the two cases might somehow be linked. Some suggested that Vinci possessed knowledge about the serial killings that had never become public. Others speculated that his murder may have been intended to silence him permanently. These ideas generated significant media discussion because they connected two of Italy's most mysterious criminal investigations. However, prosecutors evaluating the available evidence reached a different conclusion. After examining the case, they determined that no legal evidence established a connection between Vinci's murder and the monster of Florence investigation. The absence of supporting evidence proved decisive. Criminal justice systems are designed to distinguish between speculation and proof. And although public curiosity continued, prosecutors could not present allegations unsupported by demonstrable facts. Consequently, the theory never progressed into formal legal action. Investigators also explored the possibility that the murders resulted from personal revenge. Reports indicated that Francesco Vinci had experienced long-standing conflicts with individuals connected to the criminal environment in which he had previously operated. Detectives considered whether Vinci and Angelo Vargiu had been persuaded to attend a meeting before being ambushed by individuals seeking retaliation. Such a scenario appeared compatible with the fact that both victims had been completely restrained before being killed. Nevertheless, investigators encountered the same obstacle that had frustrated every other line of inquiry. No witness identified those responsible. No surviving forensic evidence connected a suspect to the crime. No murder weapon was recovered. Without evidence capable of identifying specific offenders, prosecutors again found themselves unable to proceed. The legal limitations confronting the investigation became increasingly apparent as time passed. The burned condition of the Volvo represented one of the greatest obstacles to prosecution. Fire had destroyed much of the physical evidence that normally forms the basis of homicide cases. Fingerprints, biological material, trace evidence, and numerous other forensic indicators had either disappeared entirely or become too severely damaged for meaningful analysis. The isolated location where the vehicle was discovered created an additional challenge. Detectives were unable to identify eyewitnesses who had observed the murders or the individuals responsible for abandoning and burning the vehicle. Equally significant was the inability to identify the firearm used in the killings. Without the weapon itself or sufficient ballistic evidence connecting it to a suspect, investigators lost another potentially decisive avenue of proof. Each missing piece of evidence weakened the possibility of prosecution until the cumulative effect became impossible to overcome. Prosecutors bear a responsibility not merely to suspect, but to prove. In every criminal case, the evidence presented before a court must establish guilt according to the legal standard required for conviction. That principle protects both the rights of the accused and the integrity of the justice system. In the investigation into the murders of Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu, authorities recognized that the available evidence fell short of that standard. Proceeding with charges unsupported by sufficient proof would not have served justice. Instead, prosecutors acknowledged the limitations imposed by the investigation and refrained from initiating criminal proceedings that could not be sustained in court. Consequently, no individual was formally prosecuted for either homicide. No indictment was issued. No trial commenced. No judge evaluated evidence presented by opposing sides. No jury, where applicable, considered questions of guilt or innocence. The legal record, therefore, remains defined not by courtroom testimony, but by the absence of one. Officially, the murders remain unsolved. That outcome has important implications beyond the immediate case itself. Francesco Vinci's public reputation had already been shaped by years of suspicion surrounding the Monster of Florence investigation before he himself became a homicide victim. Ironically, the legal principles that ultimately cleared him of involvement in those serial murders were the same principles that prevented prosecutors from accusing anyone of murdering him without sufficient evidence. In both situations, investigators and prosecutors were required to separate suspicion from proof. During the Monster of Florence investigation, the continuation of the killings while Vinci was imprisoned undermined the case against him. And by 1989, he and the other Sardinian suspects were officially cleared because authorities lacked sufficient evidence. Years later, following his own death, prosecutors again confronted an investigation where compelling theories existed, but legally sufficient proof did not. In both instances, the outcome demonstrated that criminal justice cannot rely solely upon appearances, assumptions, or public opinion. Evidence remains the essential foundation of every prosecution. As the investigation gradually slowed, prosecutors formally concluded that there was no legal evidence linking Francesco Vinci's death to the Monster of Florence murders. While speculation persisted in public discussion, the official position remained consistent. Based on the evidence available, investigators considered it more likely that Vinci had been killed because of his associations within the criminal underworld than because of any unresolved aspect of the serial murder investigation. Even that conclusion, however, stopped short of identifying the perpetrators. It addressed only the relative likelihood of competing motives rather than establishing criminal responsibility. Ultimately, the legal outcome of the case is defined less by what occurred than by what never happened. No suspect entered a courtroom. No confession resolved the mystery. No forensic breakthrough identified those responsible. The murders of Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu remain open in the sense that no one has ever been held legally accountable. Their case stands as a reminder that even investigations involving experienced detectives, extensive inquiries, and years of examination may fail to produce the evidence required for justice to take its final step. The legal process depends upon proof, and in this investigation, proof remained beyond reach. The murders of Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu never reached the kind of conclusion that investigators, prosecutors, or families hoped to see after a homicide. There was no arrest that finally explained the sequence of events. There was no confession that filled the gaps left behind by the burn crime scene. There was no courtroom where evidence could be examined publicly and responsibility established beyond reasonable doubt. Instead, the case slowly entered the long and uncertain existence shared by many unsolved investigations, remaining officially open in history while becoming increasingly difficult to resolve with each passing year. Time has a profound effect on criminal investigations. Memories fade, witnesses become more difficult to locate, physical evidence deteriorates, and opportunities that once seemed promising gradually disappear. For the investigators who worked the case, the unanswered questions surrounding the burned Volvo near Chiani remained exactly that, questions. Despite careful examination of the crime scene, interviews with individuals connected to Francesco Vinci, an extensive consideration of multiple investigative theories, the identity of the killers remained unknown. The passage of decades did not change the established facts. Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu had been restrained, shot, placed inside the trunk of a Volvo 245, and the vehicle had been deliberately burned. Beyond that sequence, certainty became increasingly scarce. Public discussion, however, never disappeared entirely. Francesco Vinci occupied a uniquely unusual place in Italian criminal history because his life intersected with two separate mysteries, each significant in its own way. During the 1980s, his name had become inseparable from the investigation into the monster of Florence, one of Europe's most notorious unsolved serial murder cases. Although investigators ultimately abandoned the Sardinian trail and officially cleared Vinci and the other suspects because of insufficient evidence, his association with that investigation endured in public memory. Years later, his own violent death ensured that his name would once again return in newspaper articles, documentaries, and discussions about unsolved crimes. The circumstances created a striking irony that continues to fascinate historians of crime. A man once publicly suspected of committing infamous murders ultimately became the victim of an equally unresolved homicide. Yet the irony should never obscure an essential principle. Regardless of his criminal history or his previous status as a suspect, Francesco Vinci was entitled to the same careful investigation afforded to every homicide victim. The legal system that had once required investigators to distinguish suspicion from proof during the Monster of Florence inquiry demanded precisely the same discipline after his death. Criminal responsibility cannot be established through reputation, assumptions, or public opinion. It depends upon evidence. That principle protected Vinci when investigators lacked sufficient proof to link him to the serial murders. And the same principle prevented prosecutors from accusing others of murdering him without evidence capable of supporting criminal charges. In that respect, the story serves as a powerful reminder that justice is measured not by certainty of belief, but by certainty of proof. One of the most notable developments in the case occurred decades after the murders themselves. In 2024, Francesco Vinci's family requested that his remains be exhumed for DNA testing. Their purpose was unusual but significant. They wished to verify whether the individual buried as Francesco Vinci was in fact the same person, whose body had been recovered from the burned Volvo in August 1993. The request reflected lingering doubts within the family regarding the identification made after the fire. Such concerns illustrate how unresolved homicide investigations often continue affecting families, long after official investigative activity has diminished. Questions left unanswered by the original investigation do not simply disappear with time. Instead, they frequently pass from one generation to the next, encouraging renewed efforts to seek certainty through advances in forensic science. At present, however, no public conclusion has confirmed the family's suspicions or established that the identification made in 1993 was incorrect. The exhumation, therefore, represents another chapter in the continuing search for certainty rather than a resolution of the mystery itself. Even without a definitive breakthrough, the decision demonstrates that decades-old investigations can continue to evolve as new forensic techniques become available and families pursue answers that once seemed impossible to obtain. Whether those efforts ultimately alter the historical understanding of the case remains unknown. Officially, The murders of Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu remain unsolved. No individual has been prosecuted. No one has been convicted. The motive has never been established with certainty. Investigators concluded that organized criminal connections offered the most plausible explanation supported by the available evidence. While prosecutors also determined that no legal evidence connected the murders to the Monster of Florence investigation. Those conclusions remain the official position of the case, but they stop well short of identifying those responsible. As a result, the investigation continues to occupy a distinctive place within the history of Italian crime. It exists at the intersection of documented fact and enduring uncertainty, where investigators succeeded in reconstructing much of what happened, but not who made it happen. Cases like this often invite endless speculation. Yet speculation has limited value when measured against the standards required by criminal investigation. Throughout the years, theories have emerged attempting to explain Francesco Vinci's death in dramatic or unexpected ways. Some focused upon his criminal associations. Others revisited his former status as a suspect in the Monster of Florence inquiry. The enduring public fascination with both mysteries has encouraged repeated attempts to connect them. Yet the historical record consistently reminds us that possibilities and proof are fundamentally different. Investigators examined those possibilities carefully and ultimately acknowledged the limits imposed by the evidence. That distinction deserves emphasis because unsolved cases frequently become surrounded by narratives more elaborate than the facts themselves. Responsible examination requires returning repeatedly to what investigators were actually able to establish rather than what later speculation imagined. The story of Francesco Vinci also reflects the complicated nature of public identity. Human lives are rarely defined by a single role. Vinci was at different moments a man from Sardinia who moved to Tuscany, an individual with documented criminal convictions, a former companion of Barbarillaci, a prominent suspect in one of Italy's greatest criminal investigations, a man later cleared because evidence proved insufficient, and finally a homicide victim whose own killers have never been identified. None of those descriptions alone captures the entirety of his story. Together, however, they illustrate how individuals connected to criminal investigations can occupy multiple and sometimes contradictory positions over the course of their lives. History often remembers names without preserving complexity, reducing people to suspects, victims, or offenders. The Francesco Vinci case resists such simplification because it demonstrates how those categories can change dramatically while the obligation to seek evidence remains constant. The murder of Angelo Vargiu likewise deserves recognition. Although public attention frequently centered upon Vinci because of his earlier association with the Monster of Florence investigation, Angelo Vargiu was also a victim whose life ended in the same calculated execution. Both men were discovered together. Both were restrained. Both were killed. Both were denied the justice that comes from identifying and prosecuting those responsible. Any complete understanding of the case must therefore remember that the investigation sought answers for two victims, not one. As years became decades, the burned Volvo found near Chiani came to symbolize more than a single crime scene. It became a reminder of the limitations that even determined investigations sometimes encounter. Fire destroyed evidence. Isolation concealed the offenders. No eyewitnesses emerged. The murder weapon remained unidentified. Those practical realities shaped the outcome far more than public theories or media attention ever could. In the end, the investigation was constrained not by a lack of effort, but by a lack of evidence capable of carrying the case beyond suspicion. Today, the names Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu remain part of Italy's long history of unresolved homicides. Their case continues to be mentioned whenever discussions return to the many unanswered questions surrounding criminal investigations in Tuscany during the late 20th century. Whether future advances in forensic science or newly discovered evidence will ever identify those responsible remains impossible to predict. Until such evidence emerges, the official record remains unchanged. Two men lost their lives in a carefully planned execution. Their bodies were hidden inside a burned Volvo in a secluded woodland near Chiani on August 8, 1993. Investigators explored every major avenue supported by the available evidence, but could not identify the perpetrators. Prosecutors found no legal basis to connect the murders to the Monster of Florence investigation and considered organized criminal associations the more likely context, while acknowledging that certainty remained beyond reach. More than 3 decades later, the silence surrounding the killers continues. The forest has long since returned to its ordinary stillness. The burned vehicle exists only in photographs and investigative files, and many of those who first worked the case have left their roles behind. Yet the central question remains exactly as it was on that August morning in 1993. Who restrained Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu? Who pulled the trigger? And who believed that fire would erase the truth forever? Until those questions can be answered through evidence rather than speculation, the murder of Francesco Vinci will remain not only the final tragic chapter in one remarkable life, but also one of Tuscany's most enduring unsolved criminal mysteries. More than 3 decades have passed since investigators stood beside the burned Volvo 245 in the woods near Chiani, trying to reconstruct the final hours of Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu. The flames that consumed the vehicle were extinguished long ago. The crime scene was processed, the evidence cataloged, and the investigation pursued through every avenue that the surviving facts allowed. Yet time, which often reveals hidden truths, has offered remarkably little in this case. Instead, it has preserved an enduring silence. The murders remain officially unsolved, and the identities of those responsible have never been established. For many criminal investigations, the passage of years eventually transforms certainty into history. Witnesses testify, courts reach verdicts, and official records provide a narrative that, even if imperfect, explains how justice was achieved. The murder of Francesco Vinci followed a different path. Here, the official record contains carefully documented facts about the crime itself, but leaves unanswered the questions that matter most. Investigators know where the victims were found. They know how they were restrained. They know that both men were shot before their bodies were placed inside the trunk of the vehicle, and that the Volvo was deliberately burned. Beyond those facts, however, certainty gives way to possibility, and possibility never became proof. That distinction is perhaps the most important lesson this case offers. Throughout his life, Francesco Vinci experienced both sides of criminal suspicion. During the investigation into the Monster of Florence, he was viewed for a time as one of the principal suspects because of his relationship with Barbara Lacci, his criminal background, and the investigative theory known as the Sardinian Trail. His arrest attracted enormous public attention, and many believed authorities had finally identified the serial killer who had terrorized Tuscany. Yet as additional murders occurred while Vinci remained imprisoned, the investigation was forced to confront an unavoidable reality. Evidence no longer supported the theory that had placed him at the center of the inquiry. Eventually, prosecutors abandoned that line of investigation, and by 1989, Vinci and the other Sardinian suspects were officially cleared because there was insufficient evidence to prosecute them. Years later, after Vinci himself became the victim of a carefully planned execution, investigators found themselves confronting the same legal principle from the opposite direction. Once again, theories existed. Once again, Investigators identified possibilities that appeared consistent with the available facts. Once again, however, evidence proved insufficient to establish criminal responsibility. The law required restraint where certainty did not exist. In that sense, Francesco Vinci's life illustrates how the criminal justice system must remain anchored in evidence rather than assumption, regardless of whether someone is viewed as a suspect or remembered as a victim. Another reason the case continues to attract attention is its unusual position within modern Italian criminal history. Few individuals have been so closely connected to two separate, unsolved homicide investigations of national significance. The first association arose because Vinci became one of the most prominent suspects in the monster of Florence inquiry. The second followed his own violent death in 1993. Although prosecutors ultimately concluded that no legal evidence connected the two cases, the coincidence itself has continued to fascinate journalists, historians, and readers of true crime. It is understandable why the public continues to ask whether hidden connections exist. Human beings naturally search for patterns, especially when confronted by unresolved events. Yet responsible examination requires acknowledging that unanswered questions are not themselves evidence. Investigators considered the possibility of a connection and ultimately concluded that the available facts did not support one. Accepting uncertainty is often more difficult than accepting a dramatic explanation. But uncertainty is sometimes the only honest conclusion that evidence permits. The 2024 decision by Vinci's family to request the exhumation of his remains demonstrates that unresolved investigations rarely disappear completely. Even decades after the murders, the family continued seeking certainty regarding the identity of the individual buried as Francesco Vinci. DNA testing was requested to confirm whether the remains recovered from the burned vehicle truly belonged to him. As of the publicly available information, no announced conclusion has confirmed the family's doubts or altered the official understanding of the case. Nevertheless, the request reflects a reality familiar to many families affected by unsolved crimes. Time may reduce media attention, but it does not necessarily diminish the desire for answers. Questions left unresolved often become part of a family's history, carried forward long after public interest begins to fade. The investigation also highlights the practical challenges faced by detectives when critical evidence is lost. Modern forensic science is remarkably powerful, but even the most advanced techniques cannot recover evidence that has been completely destroyed. The deliberate burning of the Volvo significantly reduced the opportunity to recover fingerprints, biological traces, fibers, and other forms of physical evidence that might have identified those responsible. The isolated location limited the possibility of eyewitness testimony, while the inability to identify the murder weapon removed another important investigative avenue. These obstacles did not merely complicate the investigation, they fundamentally shaped its outcome. The case serves as a reminder that criminal investigations are often constrained not by the determination of investigators, but by the evidence that survives. For students of criminal justice, the murder of Francesco Vinci is therefore valuable not because it offers satisfying answers, but because it demonstrates the discipline required when answers cannot be found. Detectives explored organized crime as a likely explanation. They examined Vinci's personal relationships and criminal associations. They evaluated public speculation concerning the monster of Florence. They considered the possibility of personal revenge. Each theory received attention because each contained elements consistent with known facts. Yet none produced evidence sufficient to identify specific offenders or support prosecution. In many respects, that willingness to leave questions unanswered rather than force unsupported conclusions reflects the integrity of a careful investigation. True crime stories often encourage audiences to expect dramatic revelations, hidden conspiracies, or last-minute breakthroughs. Real investigations, however, frequently end with unresolved uncertainty. The story of Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu belongs to that more difficult category of cases. Their murders resist simple explanation because the evidence never allowed one. As a result, the investigation remains open in history, not because detectives failed to search for answers, but because the available facts never revealed them. Today, the names Francesco Vinci and Angelo Vargiu remain permanently linked by the events of August 8, 1993. They were discovered together, killed together, and remembered together in an investigation that continues to challenge those who study Italy's most enduring criminal mysteries. The burned Volvo has long since disappeared from the landscape, and the forest near Chiani has returned to its ordinary quiet. But the questions left behind have not faded so easily. They remain preserved in investigative files, court records, journalistic accounts, and the memories of those who followed the case from the beginning. Until new evidence emerges, if it ever does, the official conclusion remains unchanged. Two men lost their lives in a carefully organized homicide. Investigators established what happened, but not who was responsible. No one has been prosecuted. No court has delivered a verdict. And so, like many of history's most haunting criminal investigations, the murder of Francesco Vinci ends not with certainty, but with silence, a silence that has endured for more than 30 years, reminding us that some mysteries are defined not by the stories they tell, but by the answers they continue to withhold.